Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this episode of Shariah Intelligence. I am your host Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topics are two of our distinguished facilitators and trainers in the Da'wah Institute, Brother Nasir Bello and Brother Ibrahim Bello. You are both most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Today we'll be looking at the areas of agreement and areas of disagreement among jurists. What are the kind of things they would agree on, and where they disagree, why do they disagree, and what do they do about those disagreements in order to harmonize their positions with the evidence that they use? I'd like to start by asking Malam Ibrahim Bello, with all the issues on which Muslim scholars differ, they still have those areas where they all agree. What are the kind of issues on which they agree, and what would you consider the criteria for agreement? What are those things that you know with this kind of evidence it's difficult to have disagreement?
Yeah, Muslim scholars, in spite of their disagreements on a number of issues, it's good to know that they actually agree on many things, or most things, which constitute the key things or the salient features of Islam. Usually these are things that were arrived at based on evidence that are crystal clear in their historical authenticity and their meaning. We call that Qat'i Thubut and Qat'i Dilala. Qat'i Thubut meaning the historical authenticity is undoubtful, is certain. Qat'i Dilala means it is not subjected to more than one interpretation. Like, no Muslim will disagree with that. They agree on areas of what makes a Muslim. What are the features of Islam? 5 pillars of Islam, 5 daily prayers, articles of faith, justice and fairness, speaking the truth, and even on characters, akhlaq, what constitutes good character and bad character. Prohibition of zina, prohibition of alcohol, indecency, immorality. Like all of these things, Muslims actually agree. You don't see a Muslim who has problem with this. So these are areas of agreement, and these are the things that makes a Muslim. These are the salient features of Islam. These are these are like your keystones or pillars of Islam. Of course, like we're going to see later, we are bound to disagree on other nitty-gritty of some of these things. But the key things that you can say, this is what makes a Muslim, this is what you are sure of, they agree. Usually disagreement is always when it comes to interpretation, or the authenticity of the evidence has some level of presumptiveness, or it's more likely to be subjected to more than one interpretation. But of course, even in other specialties like medicine, doctors are bound to differ based on their model, methodology, and exposure. So this is it.
Malam Nasir, what would you add to this?
As he mentioned, this area of agreement is the domain of certainty, where you talked about, where you'll be talking, or you'll be looking at things that are established by what we call certainty. Remembering this very important maxim we discussed earlier about certainty cannot be overruled by doubt, and therefore it is a domain of Qat'i Thubut, Qat'i Dilala. It is the domain where you have what scholars will call what established the ma'lum min ad-dini bil-darura, the essentials, the fundamentals of the deen, the what in other parlance you will call the minimum effective dose, something that is enough for you to establish iman, to become a Muslim. So the interesting thing is areas of agreement, you've got your minimum effective dose. On the detail, that is where you begin to see issues of difference of opinion. And you if you could remember that hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where somebody asked the Prophet, it's just like saying, okay, Ya Rasulullah, just tell me the minimum effective dose, so such that if I stick to it, I have no problem. And you find Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam responding with this ma'lum min ad-dini bid-darura, these very fundamental things that there is agreement among almost all scholars over, So this is the domain of yaqeen, this is the domain of certainty, and what this is telling us is we should be a bit we should be careful and respect the importance of unity amongst ummah, particularly knowing fully that that which has been established by something that is certain is enough to give you the minimum of what you require as a Muslim. Other things are an addition where you find domains of misunderstanding amongst scholars, or disagreement, of course.
This is interesting because, as you mentioned, that hadith where the companion was asking, if I only did these fundamental requirements, is that enough for me to go to paradise? Not just did the Prophet say yes, but as he was even moving away, the Prophet, told some of his companions, if that gentleman is to stick to just that minimum, that's an example of the person of going to paradise walking there. So what we find is that these ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura, these fundamentals of Islam that are away and outside the scope of diverse opinions, of debates among scholars, these, as basic as they may be, are the things that really matter, of enjoining right and forbidding wrong in your own capacity. And I think, as Malam Ibrahim mentioned, it's fundamental aqidah, there's fundamental areas of creed and belief, fundamental areas of worship, fundamental areas of akhlaq and behavior and goodness, fundamental areas of halal and haram, and very fundamental. You may consider them few. You can put them all on just a few sheets of paper. And so even though they may be few, they are the most important aspects of the religion. That really, this is not a religion that is difficult. What we find is people making it more complicated, and people treating the secondary issues as if they are more important than the primary issues. And you find heated debates and disagreements, friction, sometimes fighting. And when you look at what it is all about, it's on the secondary issues, unfortunately. Malam Nasir, if you could take us through, or start taking us through, when we hear there's difference of opinion among scholars, you've already said that if they agree, it's because it's qat'i thubut and dhanni thubut. In other words, the evidence is categorical in its authenticity and the meaning is definitive, categorical, clear. Qat'i dilala, sorry. So it's qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala. Thank you. And those teachings that are fundamental, full certainty about. When we say scholars differ, where does that difference come from? Could you give us some of the major reasons why scholars would differ?
Now, usually, as we said earlier, usually areas where you have qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, no disagreement. But the moment you begin to venture into the areas of dhan, and that comes about often from either silence or ambiguity of the text. In this kind of situation, then you would find scholars differing. You would find different schools of thought, that is what we call madhahib, coming up with different approaches, as we must have seen from the equations, where the moment you pass the stage of qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, you will begin to see them coming with different dhanni tools in an attempt to represent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So anything beyond this ma'alum min ad-dini bid-darura, or what we say, or outside ma'alum min ad-dini bid-darura, you would find differences of opinion, different approaches. For example, dealing with contemporary issues where you don't have any precedence in the tradition, issues around cryptocurrency today, issues around riba on paper money, issues around euthanasia and the question of ending life, issues around biotechnology, and lots more, organ transplant. These are areas, and of course, these are areas that you would always find scholars differing because of the silence and ambiguity in trying to even understand and comprehend these things. And you would also find them differing on issues to do with interpretation of text that is ambiguous. For example, when the Quran was talking about the issue of divorce and the menstrual cycle of a woman who is divorced, the waiting period, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. That statement, that word quru, that this is the time, this is the 3 cycles or 3 quru that you take, the difference of opinion among scholars about the interpretation of that particular concept. You would find scholars differing, for example, on what is the share of ulul arham when it comes to inheritance, since it is not really specified in the text. You will also find scholars differing and debating over the issues of what is the kind of permissible bid'ah, permissible music, form of music, since there is a discussion around that even recently in Nigeria about, okay, what form of music is acceptable, which one is not acceptable. So these are some of the examples you will find that are associated with silence or ambiguity of the text. Another reason that usually lead to these issues of difference of understanding and difference of interpretation or difference of opinion among scholars or disagreement generally is this issue of difference in context, difference in culture, difference in environment, and priorities of the environment and the context within which these scholars lived. And a lot of issues you can find related to this kind of cases or this kind of situation. Things like understanding what constitute. There is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ talked about the prohibition of imitating the other sex. So these are gender issues. But then if you look at different geographical contexts, if you look at different historical contexts, then you begin to ask yourself what constitute, in terms of dressing, for example, what constitute imitating the other gender. Or for example, in different political contexts, the issue of permissibility of or otherwise of demonstration as a way of communicating your grievances to the government or engaging government. What is the position of Islam? You find scholars differing, and this has so much to do with context, with culture, and the nature of the environment within which people live. Another good example is the fatwas that actually emanate from this recent pandemic that the world experienced, and the issues that actually are tied to that, issues of social distancing, issues of attending congregational prayer, and the views of scholars around all that. And you would find relevant issues that are associated to urf, maslaha, issues associated to istihsan that will always be related to this kind of difference of opinion, or issues around gender, issues around interfaith relations. So these are some of the reasons why scholars usually differ in their understanding and in their approach or opinion regarding issues.
This is very interesting. So one you mentioned is where there's silence in the text or ambiguity in the text, and ijtihad or juristic reasoning is required. And of course, we've discussed the various approaches of ijtihad that some of the schools have, and even within a school, you would have differing opinions. But then scholars may all have the same approach, but the same silence on the text, or sometimes there's even a text on an issue, but context changes. And since with change in context, with change in time, with change in place, you will have change in fatwa. Naturally, if we look at the size, the geographical size of the Muslim world, it is practically impossible for you to say scholars lived in the same culture. So, and especially today, where there's a big diversity, depending on where you are, urban, rural, this part of the world, that part of the world, we will have this kind of diversity. It's nearly inevitable. Malam Ibrahim, what would you add to this discussion of other major reasons why scholars would differ? They are scholars, so you don't say they are ignorant. Easy to say, okay, you are knowledgeable, you are ignorant. But where we've got scholars who are knowledgeable and they still disagree, what are the other reasons why they would?
Yeah, sometimes you have issues to do with texts that apparently contradict. They seem a little ambiguous. Some are saying no, some are saying no, yes to it. and where there is no detailed information on the context to clarify. Usually you have disagreements on texts to do with war and relations with non-Muslims. You have texts to do with women leadership. Difference in opinion among scholars is usually when texts look apparently contradicting. Usually you have this very common on areas of text to do with peace and war with non-Muslims. Obedience or challenging a tyrannical leadership. You have also texts to do with women testimony. You know, a number of these kind of texts and things like women testimony, like I mentioned, and a number of issues like this. Scholars are likely to differ. Why? Because of the nature of the text itself. They look contradictory because there is no detailed information on the context. Usually when you have texts that look apparently contradicting, it's because of a missing gap of context or history. So some of these things are not available, whether you can stand up for Janazah or not. Okay, so this is why scholars will differ.
So here you're saying there is text, but there some seeming conflict between the text.
Yes.
And there, I guess, scholars would have different approaches to addressing these seeming contradictions, seeming conflict within the text, which, of course, for many scholars, the conflict is actually in the, it's in the head of the scholar. There's no conflict in reality between Quran and Sunnah or between Quran and Quran. Could you say more on this? So you've mentioned, say, for example, that in War and Peace, there are verses in the Quran that deal with war, and there are verses of Quran that deal with peace. And some feel there's a conflict between the two.
No.
When it comes to this ta'arud, or apparently conflicting evidence from the Quran or the Sunnah or evidence, what's the approach that scholars take to try and reconcile or deal with these differences?
Yeah, now to start with, usually, like we say, the texts are apparently contradictory to us. But it's good to establish that, one, they are not contradicting in reality, because Allah and His Prophet will never contradict themselves. Usually they seem contradictory to us because of limitation in our knowledge, or, like intellectual ability of scholars. There's limitation as humans. So maybe there is information they've not have access to, or one scholar had access to that the other one did not have access to, or there is a historical context or angle which is more appropriate where the other one is not seeing it from that. So, but of course, like we say, we are humans and scholars are bound to differ because of this gap in history and difference in context. So to us, they look contradictory. But Allah actually knows there is a truth. Now, the Prophet ﷺ will say, my ummah will not agree on error. So it's left for scholars to struggle to really get to the root of it. But usually when scholars have these kind of issues, what they do is, number one, they try to see how they can do what you call jam'u. They reconcile these things and see which one is specific and which one is general. Okay, well, which one is relevant to a particular context, why this one is to the other. Usually that is considered the strongest and the best way to apply all the texts, since they are all from God, they are divine. One. Usually any resolution reached below reconciliation is subjective, is tentative, is debatable, because you are likely to have somebody differing with you. While some will say, okay, we agree with this. Some others will prefer, okay, after Jam'u, what is the next thing to do? But of course, that issue of Jam'u is more intellectually demanding, because it means the scholar has to exert his efforts to get all similar and relevant texts in a broader sense to see which contexts. If that is not possible, they now go to tarjih. Tarjih is also difficult. But the thing with tarjih is that sometimes you are suspending the use of one text because of what you think, okay, makes the other one stronger. Or sometimes the two might all be strong enough. So tarjih is always the next. Scholars will do tarjih, meaning you use one to weigh down the other. In other words, you prefer one.
You eliminate the
Eliminate, exactly. Using the strength of the riwayah, sometimes they look at the isnad, if it is hadith, this is weaker, this is stronger, no, this is hasan, this is da'if. If it is Quran verse, you look at a number of reasons to do tarjih. One is raji, one will be marjuh. Now, aside tarjih, they also go to naskh. Naskh will mean like abrogation in a way, even though sometimes some of us are more comfortable to say superstition. Abrogation will simply mean you cancel out one based on historical precedents, like which one comes first and which one comes later. So you want to say, okay, because this one was the first to be revealed, this was the first thing the Prophet said, that was why he was in Mecca, or that was earlier on and later. But sometimes you can get some of these things from the weddings of the Sahabas themselves. They would say, formerly we were doing this, and later the Prophet said this. But then the thing with all of these things, because most of these things are speculative or presumptive to a great extent, scholars are likely to disagree with one another. While one will believe the best way is to do jamu on these issues, other will believe naskh solves their problem. While some will say no, naskh didn't solve their problem, other will be no, there's raji and marju. So all these are some of the nitty-gritty and intricacies why when you have texts of this kind of nature, and sometimes also the nature of the Arabic language, some things are subjected to more than one interpretation, even from the Arabic language. So sometimes the context might not be too clear to show which exactly do this one stand to dictate. So these are some of the reasons why scholars have divergent opinion.
And I'd like us to look more carefully at each of these three. You've mentioned that in reality, there's the understanding among scholars that there is no real conflict between the words of Allah and the Prophet ﷺ, between the Quran and the Quran. There's no real conflict, that every conflict or contradiction is only in the minds of the person reading who has not been able to reconcile for one reason or the other. However, scholars live with that limitation, and some are able to reconcile, and some are able to reach that ideal where all the relevant evidence has been interpreted in such a way that there is harmony and no conflict. But you've said for some that is not possible, or they are not satisfied with that, and they resort to tarjih, as you put it, preference of what they feel is stronger, going with the preponderance of the evidence, where the evidence seems to be more in favor of, even though there's other evidence, but they have reasons to feel we won't factor that in, or we just feel this is stronger for one reason or the other. And you've mentioned the third approach, which is to consider one as having superseded or abrogated, and looking chronologically to say the later verse abrogates an earlier verse, or later hadith abrogates an earlier one. Malam Nasir, could we look more carefully at the one on harmonization, of reconciling conflicting evidence, this ideal which is jam', the reconciliation of all relevant evidence?
Now, al-jam', which is a reconciliation or harmonization of the relevant evidence provided, is considered by scholars as the most preferred, because it factored everything and considered every element, and at the end of the day it completely resolved the apparent contradiction within the evidences or among the evidences provided, by trying to situate each of the evidences in its own context, and of course it is the most difficult, that requires more studies, more engagement, and sometimes it needs a lot of expertise in trying to even achieve that. And you will find a lot of examples where scholars will talk about reconciling on issues, some of these evidences. For example, if you look at the text and the provision or the submissions of the text regarding issues around war and peace, where scholars are able to harmonize and identify and align most of these verses around jihad, around war and peace, with their own context. Another good example that you can find that scholars usually present as an example of a case where there was reconciliation among the evidences is this issue of custody of a child, particularly a child that is between the age of 7 to 10, or the issue of custody of a child by a mother that is actually remarrying, or example of the issue of kissing one's spouse during Ramadan, for example. Is it permissible or not permissible? You would find scholars resolving these issues. Another good example is this issue of defecating or urinating while facing or backing the Qibla. Another good example is this issue of paying back or completing missed part of a prayer, what they call al-qada or itmam of the part of prayer that one missed. And there are a number of examples that you would always find scholars bringing. For example, again, if you look at the discourse among scholars regarding the issue of will or bequest to a non-Muslim parent or relative. So there are lots of examples, a lot of issues where scholars were able to resolve and harmonize between the evidences or the evidences that seem to be or appear to be apparently contradicting one another.
If I may just, you've mentioned quite a few. So there are those verses in the Quran that some would quote and say these are promoting, fighting. Fight them wherever you find them, and this and that. And there are those that are promoting peace and permitting even marriage, etc. So just briefly, how do they reconcile these apparently conflicting verses? Are we told to fight or are we told to be peaceful?
Well, actually, what scholars try to do is to identify what we call the sababun nuzul of these verses, where certain verses were revealed at the time of peace, where interaction or relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims was cordial, and therefore there is no need for then you understand the reason why these verses were revealed in that particular manner, in that particular tune. There are certain verses that are associated with preparation or planning for a battle. There are certain verses that were revealed at the eve of the incident where Muslims were actually fighting with non-Muslims.
In other words, war has already been declared.
Exactly, war has already been declared. And there are some verses that were actually after the conduct of a war that actually they were. So if you look at the nature of relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims, it is really dynamic. It is tied to different contexts, and therefore revelation are coming in this variety of concepts or contexts in the history of the tradition. And everybody knows, for example, when war is already taking place, some of the verses that were actually ordering Muslims to fight, to kill, to do this, ordinarily every society, every civilization in this kind of context will definitely encourage its soldiers or its men and women, of course, in the battle to it motivates them for them to be able to bring to win the war and to conquer their enemies or their opponent. And therefore that is why you would find in a different context where things are normal, where the issue of peaceful coexistence is there, it's an entirely, and that is how you situate verses that actually were revealed during peacetime that talks about and encourage peace and mutual respect and peaceful coexistence generally.
So while some see a conflict between these, other scholars look at the context of the verses and say these don't conflict with the others. These are in a context of peace, these are in a context of war. What about this issue of a woman losing her custody of her child when she remarries? Some would say there's a conflict in evidence. The Prophet married Sauda and she had her children and he had no problem. She didn't lose custody of those children because she got married. But then in other places, the Prophet would tell somebody, but if you get remarried, you lose custody. Isn't this conflict?
Well, actually, even in that particular case, what most of the scholars that try to harmonize between the two would say is still context specific. It has to do, it really tied down to the husband that actually is marrying this particular lady that is remarrying. If just like in the case of Sauda, where the Prophet ﷺ has no problem accommodating her with her children, it was okay. And in the situation where the husband that is remarrying her, according to them, accept or feel comfortable and I mean decide he doesn't want her to come along with somebody's child, then that is the other context the scholars actually interpret that other hadith. So if you look at it carefully, in a context where the husband has no problem, then she can still maintain her custody according to this. That is, in this particular case, that's how the scholars actually try to harmonize the two.
So some are looking at what's the objective of the other one,
Exactly.
and in other words, what's in the best interest of the
Absolutely.
child also.
Absolutely.
This is all interesting. So one more, for example, some would say earlier on, Muslims could inherit from non-Muslims and vice versa, or say a non-Muslim parent could inherit from a Muslim son. But then later, it says the Prophet ﷺ said there's no interfaith inheritance. So is it true that, some say they can inherit? No, now they can't inherit. How do they reconcile this?
Well, what actually some of the scholars try to do around these issues, they try to differentiate a bequest, a will, from inheritance. You would find on the issues of inheritance there is a clear stipulation on who inherits what. But then there is this liberty when it comes to the issue of bequest and will. And therefore most scholars are seeing it from the angle that it has nothing to do with the religion of the other when it comes to the issue of will. But ultimately, the fact that he is benefiting from that particular wealth through the will that legitimize the issue of benefiting from it as against that which has already been stipulated.
Interesting. So some would reconcile it by simply saying the non-Muslim can still inherit, but through a will.
Exactly.
And this one is talking, that is wasiya, whereas the other one is talking about mirath.
Exactly.
And I think what you are showing is that the scholars consider various things, the objectives of this, the language, which words were actually used before we say there's a conflict, the context, and some are able to reconcile. Others still insist there's a conflict and one is abrogated or one is preferred to the other. Malam Ibrahim, coming to the subject of, let's look at abrogation. As it is usually called, naskh or mansukh, or supersession. Could you elaborate on that? How is that used by scholars?
Yeah, naskh or usually is when you assume or you think that the later revelation or text is superior or abrogates or supersedes the earlier one. Usually you need to go back to history and know the chronology. But sometimes knowing the chronology is not enough. You also need a link, historical context for a word of Sahabi or somebody saying this was before and this. But usually conclusions arrive at through abrogation are less strong, not as strong as those arrive at through Jam'u. Because they are debatable. Like nearly any verse you want to bring in the name of Jam'u is difficult. In the name of naskh is difficult, that is not challenged by another person. I remember Ibn al-Qayyim even mentioning that if at all there are verses that abrogated one another in Quran, they are not more than 5. And they are all debatable. Like this verse of where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave a ratio that justify war with the enemies. Is it 1:10 or 1:2? Some see that 1:2 abrogated 1:10. But some others didn't see it that way. You also have, according to some, zina.
Why do some not think of it as conflicting? Because if earlier on it says, if there is one of you to 2 of them, permission to fight, and then on another occasion, 1 to 10.
To fight.
Sorry, 1 to 10 you could fight, then later 1 to 2. Doesn't that look like a clear conflict?
They don't. They look at it like, okay, it just means that it depends on your strength. If you feel 1 and you're strong enough, whether with technology, whatever means, you can face 10, it's fine.
So it's tied to the kind of weapons
Yes,
you're using.
because
military
the
strength.
verse actually even stated, Allah say, Al-ana khaffafa Allahu ankum wa alima anna fikum da'afa. Now that God has eased it for you, He knows there are some weakness, or there are those of you that are weak. So if you are not, that condition is removed, you are fine. Some say you can stand, the punishment for zina is actually the ayah of Ayatul Rajim and the ayah of Suratul Nur. Abrogated this one in Suratul Nisa. And so some say no, they don't abrogate. This one is just for other indecencies and immorality. Why the one saying the Rajim, Ayatul Rajim, which was also abrogated, or that of 100 lashes, is for a particular zina, while this one is for this.
Okay, so one is more like fahisha, general
fahisha, wallati atina al-fahisha in Suratul Nisa.
Yeah.
And so they thought that was only for that, and this is specifically for zina. So it's really a case of differentiating.
Okay. So what you're saying, just to get the point, is while one verse talks about fahisha, some understand it to mean zina.
Yes.
And another verse talks about zina, and some see a conflict.
Yes.
And then some would say, therefore, this one abrogates the other.
Yes.
Whereas others look at it as, no, this is general immorality. This is specific form of immorality of sexual...
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, even including verses of wasiya and inheritance cited earlier. Some look at it as the ayah of Suratul Baqarah was abrogated with the verses of Suratul Nisa. إذا حضر أحدكم الموت إن ترك خيرا الوصية للوالدين والأقربين. That the verses of Suratul Nisa abrogated it. But some say no. This one just contextualized it. Made this one to become specific or general to those that will not inherit you. Where those ones are for inheritance, those that have specific share of inheritance. Others standing for janazah of the dead. Others also include this gradual prohibition of zina, of liquor, that at first Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, La taqrabu salata, yas'alunaka anil khamri wal maisir. That was the first. They ask you regarding alcohol and gambling. Allah say there are some benefits, but the harm outweigh the benefits. So they feel this one was abrogated by the verse of La taqrabu salata wa antum sukara. And that the final verses of Suratul Ma'idah abrogates all these two altogether. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Innamal khamru wal maisir, indeed alcohol and gambling, and a number of other things He mentioned that. And finally Allah says, Fajtanibuhu. Desist, avoid them. Some others said no, they were all contextual, they still hold. Regarding whether alcohol is useful, it's useful. There's no relationship between that and don't go to pray when you are drunk. It's still not telling you to drink, but in case you do, it's not time to pray. Okay? Some others said no. So all these kind of nitty-gritty differences and a number of verses. So it's difficult really to actually come up with one single verse that one can claim abrogation where it is not challenged by another angle or paradigm of interpretation.
This last one I think is quite interesting, where you are saying, and I think it demonstrates the angle from which scholars are coming from. So one verse says, do not go to your prayers while you are intoxicated. Later on, another verse comes and just says, Fajtanibuhu, just keep away from alcohol. And therefore, from a legal standpoint, the last verse that says, no more alcohol, is understood by some to abrogate the earlier one. However, others feel, no, this one is just saying, do not come to prayer while you are drunk. It's not telling you to drink, it's just saying, if you are drunk, do not come to prayer.
Yeah.
The later verse, which prohibits alcohol, has prohibited alcohol. If after alcohol has been prohibited, somebody still goes and drinks, you would still tell that person, do not come to prayer while you are drunk. In other words, they don't see a conflict for which one would justify abrogating another. But as you've mentioned, in every case where some scholar would consider this abrogated, another scholar is able to reconcile. The truth, unfortunately, or the way it really is some still consider it abrogated, and I'm not convinced by the
And
arguments.
even just to add, even in a hadith, not only in Quran verses, they claim abrogation of one hadith abrogating another. Like the Prophet ﷺ, in one hadith, people will claim that he said ritual bath is necessitated with intimacy once there is discharge. The other one, once there is no discharge. Or regarding whether you use your palm to rub your private part as a man, whether you repeat ablution or not. There are two versions. Which comes first? Which abrogated? Is it the riwayah of Imam al-Bukhari or that of the other person? So you have this kind of things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I think that's where some look at it as, no, if you touch, it spoils your ablution. Others look at it as, if you touch it with the intention of stimulation, or you're touching it just the way you touch another part of your body.
All those ones are scholars' intellectual
ways of reconciling.
Exactly.
Some can, some can't.
Exactly.
But I think it demonstrates that you will have differences when you have this ta'arud or conflicting evidence. The third approach that I'd like Nasser to give us some more details. We've looked at how they reconcile, and that's ideal. Where they can't, some end up saying one is abrogated. The third that we mentioned was that of tarjih, of preference or elimination. Could you tell us more on that and some examples?
Well, the third option is that of preference or elimination, where you would find scholars arguing that this is more authoritative than the other, based on the strength of evidence, based on the explicit and of course authentic nature of the evidence, or the preponderance of evidence that seems obvious. And you would find lots of examples. And the interesting thing usually is, as we mentioned earlier, on some issues that some scholars will argue that they can't be reconciled, you would find other scholars arguing that no, this is the domain of tarjih, and therefore you would find on some of these issues scholars going with the opinion that they feel according to them has the strongest evidence or more authoritative evidence. Example of that is of course the case of niqab, whether it is wajib or recommended. Or for another good example that you would find is the discourse among scholars around this issue of shaking hands of the other gender, irrespective of feelings or culture. What is the status? Is it permissible or not? The issue of woman being a guardian to another woman, just like in the case of Aisha and Barira, for example. What is the position? You'd find them saying, okay, it is permissible, it is not permissible, and you would find them arguing based on what they think is the most authoritative. Other examples around that are this issue of a menstruating woman touching the Quran or entering into the mosque. The issue of the case of apostasy, is there a fixed punishment of had, for example, of killing, or it's within the domain of ta'zir, for example.
That is to the discretion of the judge.
That is discretion of the judge on what actually should be the kind of punishment that is due for the person who did that. Another example is this issue of combining prayer, frequently combining prayer for no reason, without any visible reason, just as you would find some of these scholars will argue that it does happen during the time of Rasulullah.
What do you mean by combining prayers?
Combining prayer, for example, joining Zuhr and Asr prayer together.
Okay. Like one after the other.
Exactly.
During
exactly. Instead of waiting for the time of Asr and praying Zuhr at its own time and praying for Asr, you decide to do jam of the prayers. That is, you combine them together for no reason. So these are some of the examples you would find scholars bringing forward on the cases of tarjih.
This is very interesting because you've brought a number of controversies for which many people would feel this is all straightforward. Apostates should be killed. It's very straightforward. Women in their menstruation should not go to the mosque. That's very straightforward. They shouldn't touch the Quran. That's all very straightforward. But what you're saying is, some scholars have arrived at these positions really by having to put aside or eliminate certain evidence, just put it out of the table, off the table, because they feel the stronger evidence, the preponderance of the evidence leans in the direction of the view they hold. Other scholars, however, have not put the other evidence that this group feels is weaker. They would keep that and try and see how to reconcile these and reach differing opinions. Fine, so we've discussed these three approaches. One approach, which is ideal, is they can reconcile and harmonize the evidence, no more conflict, no more contradiction. In other places, they can't do that, so they look at which one is stronger, which one is weaker, where do they feel the strength of the argument lies, and they put aside the other evidence and go with what they feel is stronger. And then the other option would be to consider some as superseding or abrogating the other, another form of cancellation or rejecting of some text in favor of chronologically a later text. What of where they cannot do any of these? What do scholars do where the evidence they are not able to reconcile, it is so strong they cannot say this is stronger than the other, they're equally strong. The hadith or verses of the Quran just too clear. You can't say it's abrogated because there's no evidence for that, to say this particular verse abrogates another or supersedes another. What are the options for the scholar? What else can the scholar do when they are stuck with something that is an apparent contradiction? In his head he knows there's no conflict, there shouldn't be a conflict, but he sees a conflict. He can't reconcile, he can't have a reason to abrogate, he can't have a reason to prefer one over the other. What do scholars do in that type of situation?
Usually when scholars are unable to reconcile or do naskh, that is trying to abrogate or eliminate or identify, attach preference to one position over the other, what they usually do is they resort to istihsan as an option. That is juristic preference. They allow the judge now has the discretion to decide what opinion, particularly, of course, not just whims, but then he looks at the objective of Sharia and he makes his decision around that. Another option they usually consider is what they call a tawaqquf, where they just pause and suspend the whole issue. And sometimes what they do is they just consider all the two issues irrelevant or unreliable, and therefore they will just keep them aside. So these are the things they do: at tasaqqut or at tawaqquf, or they actually do istihsan, where the judge, or the scholar will decide, will make a choice, of course, based on consideration of maqasid.
This is really interesting. So what you're saying effectively is when the scholar is just confused, can't reconcile, can't decide what has been abrogated, what is stronger, the scholar would either consider the evidence as all equally valid and then pick whatever he feels is most appropriate to the context or the issue, or suspend judgment and just say, I don't have an answer. Just put pause on the issue, it's inconclusive, or disregard the evidence as all equally invalid. The contradiction, just put it aside and probably go with some other approach, as you put it, istihsan, where it's juristic discretion or juristic reasoning. Malam Ibrahim, what else would you tell us on this issue? When scholars are not able to reconcile, they take various stances. What would you say on this?
Yeah, when scholars to that matter could not agree, then those of us that are followers need to be more careful. This whole idea of he's a scholar, we should forget scholar is not infallible, he's not prophet, he's not God. So we shouldn't be blind in following them. They are human beings. They could be forgiven their sincere mistake after exerting their effort. But we will not if we deliberately choose not to take responsibility. Another thing you need to note is whatever resolution or conclusion reached through anything other than jam'u then it's tentative, it's debatable, and is not final. So we should be very careful not to be blind followers. We should follow them, but we should also be humans, where we discover, well, I'm not comfortable with this, we can change. Yeah.
This is really important, because if scholars have not been able to reconcile, then we as students of knowledge need to be really careful about coming in and taking sides and judging the other when you have to look at your level. Along the same lines, Malam Ibrahim, what would you consider the implications of opinions that have not been resolved with Jam, or where scholars continue to disagree? What's the implication of this discussion to unity in diversity and the etiquettes of disagreement?
Okay, to a great extent, Jam is the best option, and the scholar should exert more effort to try to see how he can apply all the text, as long as they certify the filter of historical authenticity. Okay, usually this apparently contradicting is more on dilala. They should try their possible means, because any other thing arrive beyond or other than jam'u is tentative, is open to debate, is likely going to be subjective. More people will disagree with you. That may be just your own opinion. Of course, the jam'u too was scholars' own opinion, but he was able to apply. So aside that, before you conclude and resort to tarjih or naskh, a number of other things can be considered. Historical context, okay, whether it was amun and khas. One is general, has general application. The other one is specific.
Or qualified.
Yeah, whether one is mutlaq or muqayyad. All those ones of where you are looking at, is one just in the literal sense. Also, we can resort to language also. The language, the socioeconomic realities, the context, and maybe we try to look at it then in history and now. Okay, so sometimes socioeconomic realities, and sometimes also we look at the verses or the text in conflict and look at it from the bigger picture of the spirit of Sharia. So it's easier to say, in the spirit of Maqasid and what Sharia stands for, this cannot be applicable here. So all these other factors, the language, the usage, in fact, even the cultural usage of the language or the norms, all of these things should be put into consideration before somebody actually take a position. And when you exhaust all possible ways, then you see, look, which is very, very unlikely. It's very unlikely that one would have exhausted all these possibilities without getting a way of reconciling. But if such happen, then justifiably you can resort to naskh or tarjih, if you are qualified to do that.
This is good, because what you have mentioned is a list of various alternative courses of action that scholars would usually be expected to take before they conclude there's conflict, before they conclude there's a contradiction. That they look at the context, they look at the language, they look at the purpose of, what's the purpose of this injunction, what's the purpose of the other one, was this general and this an exception to the rule?
Including historical relevance, what you call sababun nuzul. When you have sababun nuzul, it makes it clearer. Whether it was revealed in Mecca, also you know something.
Exactly.
Whether it was addressed to a particular group, whether it was addressed to general, because the nature of Arabic language is what one has to be very careful with. Sometimes Quran speaks as if it's a general term, but it's actually specific. It's only when you go to historical context or you look at the spirit of Sharia as a whole that you zoom down. No, this cannot just be for general application.
And sometimes it is very important to actually see, how did the Prophet implement these injunctions? How did the Sahaba understand them? Because sometimes you find there's a conflict if you just look at the literal, but if you look at how it was implemented, there's no problem. They applied this in this way, they understood this differently. Alam Nasir, what would you add to this discussion?
Well, I think if you look at the validity, according to even the scholars, the validity of tarjih and nask are tied to whether there is no, I mean, they are tied to the absence of a convincing ijma, an ijma that is actually able to reconcile this particular two. And we know very well that ijma is really, really intellectually demanding. Sometimes it requires an encyclopedic knowledge and, of course, the synergy among scholars of different specialization. And what you find is sometimes what a particular scholar is able to reconcile does not appear convincing to other scholars, and this could be attributed to not knowing the method, or not being convinced by the methodology or the legitimacy of the methodology adopted in treating or trying to reconcile these cases. And that is why it's important for us to always remember triangulation, the need to bring into perspective the role of maqasid, qawaid, and of course usul in trying to handle this kind of apparently contradicting issues or evidences. And to remember, as we discussed at the beginning, this idea of minimum effective dose, this idea of what unites us or what we agreed on constitute the essentials and the fundamentals of the deen, and not to allow that, that is issues around ma'lum min ad-dini bid-darura that we talked about at the beginning, the areas of agreement, and not to behave in a way that seems to be or appear as if what we differ over is more important than what we agreed on. And to always remember this maqasid of unity and brotherhood and civility, and to always learn to agree to disagree agreeably.
Thank you very much. I like that. Learn to agree to disagree agreeably, to not let the things that divide us, which are actually secondary, be treated as if they are more important than the ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura, those fundamental essentials that actually not just unite us, but are far, far more important compared to the others, which are products of ijtihad and change. Would like to thank you both, Jazakumullahu khairan, for your contributions in the discussion. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.